Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Now, this episode is going to be one that I kind of wanted to do for a bit, but I never really formally did it. I kind of half did it when I talked about this a little bit ago, but hopefully I can make this episode more dedicated to the topic. With that out of the way, let's get right into the news. First, another update from the Guatemalan presidential election. When we left off last, Sandra Torres was trying to get Bernardo Arevalo to not be president, and the Semilla party was in disarray due to certain electoral issues that they were having. And one of the losing candidates, Edmund Mullet, stated that there were two very likely scenarios to what would happen next. Both of which were not ideal, but one was better than the other. The one that was chosen was surprisingly the better one, because the Elections Board of Guatemala has concluded that, they have officially certified Bernardo Arevalo as the winning candidate of the race, thus guaranteeing him, without any extenuating circumstances, guaranteeing him the ability to become president of Guatemala in the future. However, his party is still suspended, and there doesn't seem to be any indication to say that there's going to be any improvement in that situation. And remember, this was a party that wasn't even necessarily the big winner in the legislative chamber anyways. So the legislative chamber was already stacked against Bernardo Arevalo, but it's now going to be even more stacked against him if his party won't be able to even take their seats. The situation is still developing. We'll have to wait and see. Speaking of a situation that is now developing, this one happened almost immediately, big deal. So the country of Gabon held an election on the 26th of August. The incumbent president was a man by the name of Ali Bongo of the Gabonese Democratic Party, which is a center-right Pan-African party that ruled over the country ever since its independence from France since the 1960s. And most, if not all, people concluded that the party was basically a corrupt, right-wing, all this, typical spiel from African nation. Most, if not all, the elections that Gabon has usually has worldwide people decry it as, rigged. This election was poised to be no different, with many people concluding that Ali Bongo was rigging the election, to the point where he was declared the winner before any results were even found. But one thing that was interesting was that almost immediately after he declared himself the winner, the military started being a bit more aggressive. They started, closing places off. They started being more going around, and people were wait, what's going on? And it was shown minutes after he declared himself the winner, he was overthrown in a military coup. One thing that is interesting is that the person who ended up taking over after him is Brice Clotaire Oligui Nguema, who is the cousin of the incumbent president. And he stated that the reason why they conducted the coup was because discontent with the president, and they just generally didn't think that he was running the country good. And he was also becoming incredibly authoritarian due to the fact that he was choosing to run even though he wasn't supposed to be able to run due to term limits. This, of course, being the 8th successful coup to occur in West and Central Africa since 2020. One in Chad, one in Guinea, the most recent one being Niger, Burkina Faso happening twice, and Mali happening twice. Now, some people in certain spheres of Twitter are trying to spin this as a sort of positive, as they're oh, this is supposed to be them taking back Africa. They're taking back Africa from the French colonial rule. And it's yes, there is still issues with, colonialism within Africa still. Most, if not all, nations in the world still want to use Africa for their resources, and a lot of Western influence is put into a lot of their culture. What's one of the biggest reasons that they're incredibly homophobic? It's because of a lot of Western churches going to the country and converting a lot of them, which in a way is still considered somewhat colonialist, because they're still pushing Western values over this continent. And due to many of the leaders within these nations being subordinate to Western powers and global economic powers, eventually what's going to happen is the people in those countries want some sort of change, and they don't care where the change comes from, which leads to the strength of military strongmen. I hate to say it, but in Africa, your choices for basically any form of leadership in Africa are either A, some corrupt politician that's bought and paid for by whichever global economic power wants them to be there, or a military strongman who is also beholden to some sort of global economic power. And in the very rare exceptions, someone in the latter group just doesn't want to be part of the global economic powers. Like Thomas Sankara. Hopefully things will improve for Africa. Like every other nation in the world, I want them to prosper. Speaking of Africa and prospering, there's one African nation that is going to be facing some turbulence that may or may not stop or improve their prospering. In a bid to unseat the long-ruling African National Congress, 7 South African parties reach a coalition agreement. 7 opposition parties in South Africa reached an agreement Thursday to form a coalition to unseat the ruling African National Congress if it fails to gain an outright majority in next year's general election. The parties, which include the country's main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, and a string of small parties, agreed on what they called a multi-party charter for South Africa. The agreement followed 2 days of meeting in Kempton Park east of Johannesburg. So for those who don't necessarily know all of South African politics, ANC is the party of Nelson Mandela, and it has been the long-standing ruling party of South Africa since since apartheid ended. It's been the party that has controlled South Africa, and due to the fact that they have tied themselves basically exclusively to the anti-apartheid movement, due to their fact that their leader was freaking Nelson Mandela, they've been able to breeze by with basically really good election results. They've always won. They've ruled since the end of apartheid, ruling a country for 29 years and not having to rig an election in order to do it. Pretty big accomplishment. But if you look at the electoral results, you'll notice something interesting. Let's look at them. Nelson Mandela, 62.65%. Then in the following 2 elections, 66.35, 69.69, 65.9, 62.15, and in their most recent ones, 57.5. And if you look at the seat totals, you notice they get a huge jump in the first one, then they gain a couple of seats, and ever since the Zuma administration, they've just been steadily draining seats. They're still in first. They still win a decent number. They still basically get to rule with almost no need for a coalition. First they needed a coalition, then they needed another coalition, but ever since then, they've ruled with basically a majority. In fact, in 2004, they had a supermajority. But when you keep getting first place, you kind of get complacent. And that's what the African National Congress has sadly done. A lot of their leaders have gotten complacent. A lot of corruption has happened behind the scenes. People are not necessarily saying that they are living up to their expectations. And as such, that has led to a rise in opposition to the African National Congress. Not exclusively right-wing opposition. One of their major opponents nowadays is the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is basically a party to their left, but it is also a very strange party. Many people claim that they're the Kill Whitey party, and even though that's not technically true, they definitely sort of teeter on that line. But this massive coalition is basically the right-wing parts of the South African political spectrum. Again, very interesting. The top one is the Democratic Alliance, and they're trying to unite forces to try and stop the African National Congress and the Economic Freedom Fighters, because there is sort of a lingering fear in South African politics that the ANC will not be able to get a majority government in the next election, which is 2024. But they're not necessarily worried that they won't be able to they won't be able to become the government at all. There's a lingering fear that they might have to go to the Economic Freedom Fighters for help to build that government, which is a little bit troubling, especially for the right side of the aisle. The major right-wing figureheads, like the biggest one being John Steenhuisen, they're basically, let's just be real. If you look at the Our Campaign's website of the party leaders of the opposition, two of the people who are look at the people running for South Africa president based on their parties, look at the party leaders of two of them, and yes, those are the two people who are leading the opposition to the African National Congress. Right around the time there's this huge narrative that there's this big anti-white movement coming from the South African left. Not much else to say at the moment, we'll just have to wait and see how this works. But I would have to take a wild guess that it's going to work just as well as this country's major opposition, which, of course, that means we're talking about Mexico. Because the Mexican election is right at the point where it's about to get interesting, because something big just happened on the opposition side of things that just officially changed everything. Okay, so the situation was going like this. They were going to be conducting more polls to decide on what to do next. You remember the process on how the opposition was supposed to choose their candidate, right? It doesn't matter if you did, because I'm going to explain it to you again. So from July 4th to the 9th, people who wanted to become a candidate of this coalition would have to submit a registration. They'd have to send 3 papers to each of the parties within the coalition. Then from July 12th to August 8th, all of the people who did so would then have to go around and get signatures for their application. And you needed to get 1,500,000 total signatures, with at least 1,000 in 17 out of the 32 states. Then on August 10th, they would hold a forum with all the people who met these qualifications. Then from the 11th to the 14th, polls would be conducted, and then after the results were shown, the top 3 candidates would move on to the next round. Meanwhile, everyone else would be kicked out. Then from the 17th to the 26th of August, 5 forums would be held where all of the 3 people who made it to this round would participate in. Then from the 27th to the 30th, a second opinion poll would be conducted. Then on September 3rd, they would hold an online poll, which would have everybody who signed up in the previous steps participate and look into all these candidates, and then choose which of the 3 top vote getters they would choose for their candidate. And both of these last 2 things would count for half. So when they would tabulate the results, the winner of these 2 things would end up becoming the candidate for the opposition. And at first, things seemed to be going good. First, they had the people sign up. 33 people ended up applying. Then, only 13 managed to make it to the next round. Then when it moved on to the next round, where they had to start asking people to sign up for their petitions, it seemed to be going good as well. Some people realized they had no chance and just decided to stop asking people for their signatures. Some tried regardless and didn't do so hot. And in fact, quite a number of them. This one's funny. Sergio Ivan Torres got 290 people to sign his petition. Give credit, he did at least try. But due to the fact they not only need to meet this certain number of people to sign, but they also need to meet a certain number of people in each of these areas, that led to only 4 people ending up making it to the next round. Enrique de la Madrid, Santiago Creel, Beatriz Paredes, and Xóchitl Gálvez. If I had to take a wild guess, I would assume they at least wanted, I assume that they thought that they would get at least 6 people. But hey, the process was still working. They just had to speed up the process a little bit. Then they did the poll, and surprisingly, Enrique de la Madrid was very easily not making it to the next round, so he decided to move on. But then, that's when things started changing, because after Enrique de la Madrid dropped out, because the poll said that he wouldn't make it to the next round, that's when it seemed like they started doing a little bit of a interesting thing, because now all the people on the Mexican right wing were trying to speed up the process even more so, basically saying it's a done deal for Gálvez, even though when you look at the polling results for this round, it's not really. 38% wanted Gálvez, 26% wanted Paredes, 20% wanted Creel, and 15% wanted Madrid. Like, I mean, sure, it is somewhat lopsided in Gálvez's favor, but it's like, not really that much at the moment. Then, all of a sudden, Santiago Creel suspends his bid for the presidency and asks all of his supporters to unite behind Xóchitl Gálvez. And he's not the only one to do this. The PRD started openly supporting Gálvez. Many people in the citizens movement openly started supporting Gálvez. Even Vicente Fox came out of the ground to support Xóchitl Gálvez. And it seemed that everybody on the Mexican right wing were not only trying to get people to support Xóchitl Gálvez wholeheartedly, but were also heavily pushing for Beatriz Paredes to drop out of the race. But Beatriz Paredes wasn't budging. Ironically, she was the only thing that was preventing this process from essentially just becoming El Dedazo again. And throughout the entire process, they were basically demeaning Beatriz Paredes the whole time. Then came the second opinion poll, and even though the results weren't slated to be released until people were supposed to start voting in the online round, for some reason, they decided to release the results early, on the 30th. Then, that same day, Beatriz Paredes' party, the PRI, announced that they were no longer going to be supporting her for the presidency, and they would be wholeheartedly backing Xóchitl Gálvez. Now, Beatriz Paredes could have still ran, but due to the fact that her own party, removed the rug from her, there was really nothing left to do, so she decided to suspend her bid for the presidency. And due to this, Xóchitl Gálvez remained to be the only candidate in the race, thus guaranteeing that Xóchitl Gálvez is the candidate for the Frente Amplio por Mexico. So, at the end of the day, this did just become El Dedazo with extra steps. And things are about to get even more heated because, as the day I'm recording this September 3rd, which was supposed to be when they revealed their results, this is the ending of the Juntos Hacemos Historia coalition's process. Between the 3rd and the 6th is when they will be revealing who their candidate will be, i.e. Claudia Sheinbaum. Sheinbaum is considered the more favorable to win of all the candidates regardless, so it's very obvious that she would be the candidate that they would choose. And all that's left is for the citizens movement to finally make their decision on what to do. See, due to all this, it really does seem like they are going to be moving forward with their own nominee, but we have still yet to see. Speaking of things we have yet to see, a very interesting development came from the GOP presidential primary, because even though it is vastly early in the race, we have gotten our first dropout in the race. The candidate in question being Francis Suarez, the one Republican that made a big stink about the fact that he didn't support DeSantis in his last, I think in his first bid. I think in the second one he did end up supporting him. But anyways, he, it's the funny thing. He made his whole big spiel about how, somebody who didn't make it into the first debate shouldn't shouldn't be in the race. Afterwards, they should suspend their bid. He didn't end up making it into the first debate, so he had to live up to his word and drop out of the race, a mere 77 days after he, actually entered the race. Many people are trying to look into it to see, if this qualifies him to be the shortest presidential bid in history, but it seems that the current person who holds this record is Fred Harris, who announced his campaign on September 24th, 1971, then withdrew on November 10th of that year, which meant that he would have been only running for 48 days. There really isn't much else to say other than the fact that Asa Hutchinson seems to be the next person on the chopping block. I had to take a wild guess he'd probably be next. I don't know, I did get one person saying, oh, well, I don't think that they'll be dropping out this early. It's I didn't say they'd be dropping out this early. Aside from Suarez, I don't know when they will drop out. I just predicted their dropout order, which I maintain. I maintain that that's the dropout order that's going to happen, unless it doesn't. If it doesn't, then I'll be wrong. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's move on to the main topic of this video. We're going to be discussing Labor Day, Basically, this would be something that probably would get the full editing procedure if I felt that this would probably be a worthy enough video topic for a main series video. But in this episode, we're going to be going over some of the historical elements of Labor Day. Why do we celebrate Labor Day? Why is there Labor Day? And why doesn't Labor Day fall on the Labor Day that most other countries have? Strap yourselves in, folks. We're in for a doozy. Most people know that after the Civil War, that's when labor activity in the United States started becoming a lot more prominent. And one thing that a lot of people in the labor movement wanted was more time off. We saw back in the day, people were fighting for the 8-hour workday, people were fighting for the weekend. Outside of fighting for better working conditions and better pay, one thing is at the very least, can we have more time off for leisure? Most people don't necessarily understand how work in the United States was back then, but back then, your hours were completely up to the boss. You only had one day off, a day that you were essentially forced to go to a boring, dank building to talk about a fairy tale. All the while you were getting paid pennies and you could potentially lose your life in terrible working environments. And this of course led to the rise of many left-wing movements in the United States which advocated for unions and labor organizing and as such further radical political action. But then many people within the labor movement started talking about an idea, something that would somewhat ease the tension, have workers be celebrated in the United States, and it would give them time off. Having a holiday called Labor Day. There is one bit of historical debate though, because two men are credited with the original creation of Labor Day, and you can kind of see why there's a little bit of debate on which of these two men have debates over which of them started Labor Day, because they both have the exact same last name. On one end, there's the story that the Labor Day was originated in a General Assembly of the Knights of Labor convened in New York City in September of 1882. The first Monday in September happened to fall during the date that they were convening the convention. And on that day, they decided to hold a parade celebrating labor. And one of the people in attendance was the secretary of the Central Labor Union named Matthew McGuire, who after that parade proposed that the Knights of Labor should celebrate Labor Day on the first Monday of September every subsequent year. You may remember the name Matthew McGuire as he was also the vice presidential candidate of the Socialist Labor Party in 1896. However, another person claimed that idea was actually his, Peter J. McGuire, a vice president of the American Federation of Labor, who was visiting Toronto in May of 1882, and while there, he saw that there was a massive parade celebrating labor, and then when he went back to America, he went to the Central Labor Union and made the claim that there should be a general holiday for the laboring classes. And he suggested the 1st September of the year because it was midway between the 4th of July and Thanksgiving. Who's right? Who's wrong? I don't know. And it doesn't really matter. What it seems that this debate is it seems to be the argument between the labor movement. Because the labor movement has very much a long-standing a bit of arguing. On one end, we have the ones hearkening into explicitly socialist and leftist political tradition. Then on the other end, we have the more moderate labor unions, both of them making claims that they are the true figureheads and the true leaders of the labor movement. And as such, they both want to take credit for the creation of the holiday literally to celebrate labor. However, initially, nobody really wanted to do this. They didn't want to make a holiday organizing for labor. So most people kind of just moved on and kind of focused on other issues for labor. But there was also another interesting thing that happened. So, in 1885, the American Federation of Labor was passing a resolution calling for the adoption of an 8-hour workday. And when they passed the resolution, they say that it would go in effect on May 1st, 1886. And considering the 8-hour workday was one of the biggest accomplishments that they wanted to do in labor organizing, now many people in the labor movement wanted to celebrate May 1st as the American Labor Day, instead of having it be the first Monday in September. But this wasn't necessarily set in stone yet. So what they decided to do to make sure that the 8-hour workday would go as planned on that day, they were going to organize a general strike to support the 8-hour workday. So on May 1st, 1886, thousands of workers went on strike and attended rallies to support the 8-hour workday. The numbers of people who participated in the strikes ranged from 300,000 to 500,000. And many prominent union leaders and leftist leaders were trying to push for this. However, even though it was very well organized, there were some workers that didn't end up following through and ended up crossing the line, even after a couple of days of protesting. So what ended up happening was, at the end of the workday on May the 3rd, people were still striking, but the people who were in the crowd who were trying to organize and make sure the 8-hour workday would pass decided to confront the people who crossed the line. And due to the clashes, police got involved and started shooting at the strikers, 2 of which would end up dying, which led to the very radical members of the union organizing, anarchists, to get pissed. And they decided to distribute flyers calling for a rally outside of Haymarket Square. But there was a little bit of a debate on whether this was going to be a peaceful rally or not, because the anarchists who printed the flyers had the words, "Working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force," which caused some of the more moderate members of the rallies to be like, that's a little weird, that's a little sus, dude. And they're like, yeah, we're just heated at the moment. So they basically just reprinted the flyers, taking out that line. The following day, on May 4th, many prominent labor activists would begin speaking to a crowd that ranged from 600 to 3,000, police officers on standby because of Red Scare tactics. I should say this, most of the organizers of this event were anarchists, so when I say the more radical members, I don't necessarily mean that the anarchists were the evil ones, but I mean like radicals within the anarchist movement. Some came with more open, peaceful intentions, and then others came for like anger. And here's the thing, you see, most people actually at the time were saying that this event was going pretty well. The mayor of the city at the time was actually watching the event unfold, and the situation seemed so peaceful. He's like, okay, this really isn't a concern, and he went home. And the weather was starting to get bad, so they're like, we'll just head home too. One of the speakers, which was Reverend Samuel Fielden, came in and spoke for like 10 minutes, which again, by that time, many people were dispersing from the crowd. However, at around 10 p.m., just as he had finished his speech, police arrived and were now officially ordering the crowd to disperse. But then right as the police showed up, someone in the crowd threw a homemade bomb, killing one of the police officers in question. Then the police started shooting at the crowd, killing at least 4 people and wounding as many as 70. And to this day, it is apparently regarded as the most deadly incident of officers being killed in the line of duty by the Chicago Police Department, with around 60 police officers being wounded. And after this event, of course, anarchists and communists and leftists and union leaders were very much demonized afterwards. The New York Times having the headline of the event being "Rioting and bloodshed in the streets of Chicago, 12 policemen dead or dying," and reported that Fielden spoke for 20 minutes, twice as long as he actually did, and alleging that as the speech went on, he got more wild and violent as they proceeded. And in another article, 2 days later, stating the villainous teachings of anarchists bore bloody fruit in Chicago, and before daylight, at least a dozen stalwart men have been laid down their lives as a tribute to the doctrine of Herr Johann Maus, and it referred to strikers as a mob, and used quotation marks around the term working men. And what happened was that due to the proximity of this event, the Haymarket Affair, with the May 1st event. Like, in fact, like, the May 1st event was literally what caused the Haymarket Affair to begin with. Due to that, many more radical members of the leftist movement wanted the Workers' Day to be on May 1st, essentially leaving the September Labor Day holiday to be more in line with what many of the reformist leftists wanted. And this ended up leading to the September Labor Day to become instantly more popular to celebrate labor, because that way you couldn't give May 1st to the anarchists. In 1887, Oregon became the first state in the United States to make Labor Day an official public holiday, and it quickly started spreading from state to state, with, again, many people choosing that date specifically so that they could not give the leftists exactly what they wanted. One person who was very, very, very hesitant on making May 1st Labor Day was Grover Cleveland, but Labor Day remained a state issue until another labor dispute happened, and that labor dispute being the Pullman strike, which happened in 1894, another strike in Chicago. The Pullman strike happened as a response to the Panic of 1893, which caused the Pullman Railroad Company to have to cut wages and lay off workers, but not reducing rent in their company towns. I should probably mention what that is. A company town is, well, this was way more prominent back in the day, but a company town was when a company, in order to keep workers in a certain area so that they can live, like, so they can work on their stuff, they would literally buy out entire areas and then turn it into a town. They would own everything in that town. They would own the stores, they would own everything, and they would essentially have you live in that town that they built, and in, like, as a reward, you would get to work for them. Weird that they pay you a salary that you then have to use to pay them rent. I'm guessing the only reason why they have you go through that extra step is so they don't get accused of being feudalism. In fact, one prominent aspect of the company town is the company store, which is where they would, again, own the store that you would then have to pay to do stuff in. So again, like, this is how draconian it was. The companies would literally own the entire town that you would live in, a thing that Walt Disney literally wanted to do with Disneyland. But anyways, the leader of the American Railway Union at the time, Eugene V. Debs, saw the situation and how BS it was, and decided, you know what? Let's try and use this to get people to join our union. But then, when they tried to get people to join the union, the Pullman company was like, no, we don't recognize your union. So Debs not only decided to have the workers go on strike, but also did something more big, in which he called on all the other areas that were associated with the American Railway Union and have Pullman cars literally be stopped on the rail tracks in order to prevent the Pullman company from even getting a profit. This move being seen as big because it really showed how strong labor could be. And eventually, police and the army were called into the situation to deal with the protesters. Debs would then be jailed and politically persecuted, and then would be pushed to become one of the biggest prominent socialists in the history of the United States. And it was during this debacle that the bill to create a federal holiday of Labor Day was starting to be floated in the Congress. It would end up being passed, and Grover Cleveland would end up signing it. Literally the quintessential explanation of how BS this situation could be. He literally sent the army to go deal with the protesters and kill a bunch of them, but he gives them a day off from work. However, due to this fact, that made it so that only federal employees would get the day off. And it had to take more striking, especially in the 1930s, to make Labor Day sort of be considered not just a federal holiday, but like a holiday that literally would require a day off. A statutory holiday is what it's called, apparently. And now Labor Day is essentially considered just that one extra day you get off of school or work, with its unofficial status now being like the day that ends summer. Maybe you can get a sale on something on that day. But we lefties, we know the truth of Labor Day. We understand the roots. And with this video, hopefully we won't forget it in the future. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified if a future video of mine comes out. And if you want more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.